It is that time. This, of course, is the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is indeed my show. I'm a bit hoarse this morning, in fact, running a bit behind this morning also. But I am on time for my guests, so that's positive. I see him in the background. I am going to bring him on. First and foremost, I want to welcome you all to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. My voice would modify over the course of the show like some horse. But that being said, we are going to have a damn good show for you today. Tim Anderson is about to join in the next couple of minutes, probably the next 30 seconds. We're also going to have Dimitri Lascaris. He's going to be on a bit later in the day, and we're going to have the man himself, the man my mom calls the Godfather, Michael Maloof. He is going to be on the show a bit later today also. But I want to bring my man on. We're joined Tim Anderson, and just to put a head on it, Tim Anderson is writer, internationalist, academic director for the Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies. Tim, welcome to the show, man. You are the person I really wanted to talk to, and so I appreciate you joining me this morning. Well, this evening for you.
Good morning, Jamal.
So I guess the first thing to hit is all of the chatter and the talk about negotiations. Now, it was put out in all sorts of media outlets that the United States and Iran came to some sort of a deal, but the Trump administration and, of course, the Iranian leadership would need to sign that deal, meaning it is tentative at best. I guess let's step into that first before getting to some of the other issues, such as Netanyahu apparently pushing the Trump administration to murder the lead negotiator, Galibov. But give me your take on this idea of negotiations. Do you think this is just chatter, chum in the water for the media to talk about, or do you think there's something real here?
I mean, the problem is that the Trump regime is, they're chronic liars, for one thing, and there's a constant stream of these assertions about what other parties are doing, which is usually false. I imagine the media in the US is a little bit similar to what we've got, or the other way around, that the Australian media is rather slavish on repeating what comes out of Washington. And so really people are being fed a steady diet of assertions by Trump and by his minions that somehow the whole world is kowtowing to him and providing wonderful things for him. And then each of those illusions has to be popped for some reason, because people print these sorts of assertions without going back and having a look. For example, looking at Iranian sources about these sorts of things. There hasn't really been any serious negotiation at all, basically, since the US began this war at the end of February. Except to the extent that they had some talks in Pakistan where Trump and his team said they were going to accept the idea of talks based on Iran's 10 points, and then they proceeded to ignore them basically and just demanded what they thought they were going to demanding. So what they their maximum demands, which they couldn't achieve through a war, and they thought they could simply assert it and that the Iranians were going to cave in for some reason when they'd effectively been successfully deterring the attacks. So this is a constant problem, basically, that each time one of the assertions by the Trump administration gets knocked down, another one comes up. All you have to do really is go to some of the normal Iranian sources and see what's coming out of their side. But most of the Western media doesn't even seem to do that. They seem to be happy to say an authoritative source is the Pentagon or the White House or something like that, and then perhaps buried down, on paragraph 11 is a denial from the Iranian foreign minister, or some of the more like, for example, Professor Marandi, who's effectively a sort of a de facto diplomat, more or less. He's an advisor, really. He's not a government official, but he is able to say reliably what the Iranian side has agreed to or not agreed to. And there's very little that they've agreed to in terms of what comes out of the Trump administration. So Nothing much has changed. Iran maintains the Straits of Hormuz. The US has been resuming some attacks to try and see if there's some sort of possibilities for them, but there aren't really. And all of the serious so-called realist commentators on the US side have admitted some weeks back that effectively Trump lost, and has been looking for some way to recast that in some other way, basically that Trump can't re-seize the Straits of Hormuz. The Straits of Hormuz was a gift, effectively, that the Israelis and the US gave to Iran with the war, basically, because Iran was not trying to impose security controls on Hormuz before that. Now they are, and they've said very clearly, we're not going to give it up either, because they want to regulate it for security grounds. And it doesn't matter what people say about international law, really, because if Iran feels it's threatened by enemy shipping pass through there, they're going to control it. You know, whatever people who ignore international law when it comes to Gaza and Palestine and Lebanon and waging war on Iran, now all of a sudden want to say that Iran is doing something extraordinary. Really, Iran is going to defend itself, basically, and take advantage of the fact that it's not a party to UNCLOS, and it can regulate with its security concerns its territorial waters. That's the end of the story. Basically, Iran's not going to give that up, and Iran's not going to give up its security, basically. So I think it's sort of recast in different ways by some US advisors. I saw one guy recently saying that Iran is trying to shake down the US for money. I mean, that's just recasting the fact that the US administration has been stealing Iran's assets in the name of unilateral sanctions. And Iran is saying, as part of the conditions of some sort of agreement, that the US should unfreeze or give back the money that was stolen, Iranian money that was stolen. It's not like the Iranians are claiming someone else's money here. And the main part of the regulation of the Straits is really about security from Iran's point of view.
It's about security. It's a flat fact. Yeah, it's not just Iran's point of view. They were attacked. And I agree with you. All of this quibbling about international law, my argument has been for years, international law does not exist. It just doesn't exist. I mean, the United States is blockading Cuba right now and complaining about Iran blockading the Strait of Hormuz. Right? Like they're doing these two things at once. It's insane.
The Trump administration, Trump himself, has said that effectively the international law doesn't exist. And that's being interpreted by other larger independent states like Russia. I recall reading Alexander Dugin saying that, look, this is the state of international affairs now. The US regime, which has purported to be the world dictatorship, says international law will be what we think it is, basically. In other words, it doesn't exist really. And Dugin is saying the Russians should now do something to demonstrate that they are part of the new system and not, in other words, it is given effectively to other states who are at odds with the strategic objectives of the US, which is a large part of the world, but many of them are too intimidated to do much about it, that perhaps they should do something rather extraordinary and outrageous to accommodate themselves within the new regime. Otherwise, they'll be seen as weak and they'll be walked over, basically. So expect very, very few countries have stood up to the US, but of course, Iran and Russia are two of them, basically. And in a sense, they've done it in a very civil way, I should say, really, until now. And there are some people urging that perhaps they should be a little less civil about that. But from Iran's point of view, you know, what we had for a very long time was this idea of strategic patience, which I think many people were privately frustrated by, basically, you know, that why is Iran so polite? Why is it so patient? And the answer is that they were waiting for the big one when the US was going to directly attack it. And then since the US directly attacked Iran, the gloves are off effectively. Iran is still operating according to its own view of ethics and the ethics of war and morality, basically, and in terms of the weapons they use and who they target. And you can see very clearly that the civilian count in Iran is far higher than the civilian count of the casualties of this war in the states that are ranged against it. And you've got some of the Persian Gulf Arab states that have participated directly in the attacks on Iran, but still there are very few civilian casualties even in those states. So Iran is pursuing its own view of the ethics of war and morality, basically, but it doesn't really behove the US or the Israelis to start talking about international law after what they've been doing in recent months.
I want to show you an alcoholic that just so happens to be somewhat of a high functioning alcoholic and has been able to make it to head the Secretary of War. Or basically, I want to show you the Secretary of War in the US. And I want you to listen to what he is saying and give me your comments on what he's saying. This came out, I think it was yesterday, give or take. Obviously, I'm talking about Pete Hegseth. This is him.
Step up and meet the do your, and when you do your job, the adversaries know what's coming for them. And that's when they either step up and meet the fury of the American military or back down, and you create a whole bunch of options for America and the president with what he wants to execute on behalf of the American people. So right now, hey, Iran has a choice. Meet at the table with the president and give up their nuclear program. And as the president said, I'm lost on time, 2 days ago now, in the cabinet meeting, I'm sitting right next to him. He looks in the camera and says, well, Iran can either do it the right way with a deal across the table, or they can deal with my guy on the left.
Now, obviously, what's wild about this is that we're not dealing with, as you pointed out, Iran has done everything in their power to avoid civilian casualties. The United States is not. We had no issue murdering women, children, hospitals, schools, etc. So Hegseth is trying to make it as if the president, this moral man, is trying to give Iran time for a deal. Otherwise, he's going to send in his lethal killers. That's not really the reality, though. I mean, they've already tried to send in their lethal killers. It didn't work.
Yeah, if they could, they would, basically. And they've thrown their best at it. And look how far they've got. They've created a new problem for themselves by Iran now having this very important economic asset. But also, on top of that, Iran has demonstrated to the world that the US is not all powerful. It can't impose its will in all circumstances. And there's a lot of countries that are paying attention to that, not least, of course, Russia and China. They're looking at the weapons. They're looking at the fact that what was previously considered a medium power, a middle size or regional power, Iran, can hold its own against what was supposedly the single superpower in the world or the global dictatorship. It doesn't have that influence anymore. And every state is recalculating now. Imagine also, of course, the so-called allies of the US, in not least Persian Gulf Arab regimes, but also the South Koreas and the Japans and some of the European states that have decided to cooperate with Iran, like France, to get their ships through the Straits of Hormuz and so on, because that's the criteria, basically. If states are not engaged in waging war on Iran, they'll get permission to go through the Straits of Hormuz for their allied tankers to go through there. That's what's been happening already, basically. So I think, Hegseth is known for being a person who likes to, talk things up, basically, and talk tough. But really, he's thrown his best lot at Iran, and we see where we are now. Basically, it's a standoff. They can't get control of the straits. They can't steal the enriched uranium that Iran has. Iran says they're not talking about that anymore. It's not really on the table even. Basically, it's always been a pretext, in my view, ever since well before the JCPOA with Obama. Basically, it was a pretext back there. The fact of the matter is the Israelis don't like the fact that Iran has a strong presence and influence in the region that Israel wants to control, basically. Not, of course, by supporting the Palestinians, by supporting the resistance in Lebanon and Iraq and other parts of the region. And they just wanted to cripple or somehow divide and weaken the Iranian state. Basically, that's what they've been trying to do, but they haven't succeeded in that. Unfortunately, from their point of view. So it doesn't matter how much Trump or Hegseth talk it up, it doesn't make it look any better, basically.
So DropSite, this is Ryan Grimm's outlet, has been reporting, and I'm just going to read it to get your take on this. Israeli officials are privately urging the Trump administration to completely abandon Iran negotiations, assassinate Iran's lead negotiator, Ghalibaf, I think he's head of the parliament, and immediately restart strikes targeting Iranian oil and energy infrastructure to trigger, quote, regime change in Iran. Now, I don't doubt that the Israelis were probably telling Trump, hey, it just needs a short, blunt, violent attack, and you'll be able to change the government of Iran, and unicorns will come out of the blue, and et cetera, et cetera. That didn't happen. I also don't doubt that this is what's taking place. Well, let me ask just the flat question. A, do you think, is it the U.S. that is trying to blame this on the Israelis, or is it the Israelis really pushing the U.S. to murder the lead negotiator, et cetera, et cetera? I guess I'm asking, do you believe this report? And give me your take on it. Tim, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I thought you were going to play something. Yeah, sorry.
No. It was a question. I'm sorry.
Right.
They are saying that Israel, I would imagine Netanyahu specifically, is urging the Trump administration to murder the lead negotiator, Ghalibaf, and to basically resume strikes on infrastructure. That this is effectively what Israel is lobbying the United States to do.
We know from insiders like Joe Kent, for example. Joe Kent said that's exactly what was suggested at the beginning, why this war was initiated, or the latest phase of it on February the 28th this year, was because Netanyahu was telling Trump it was going to be easy, it would collapse like a house of cards. The population was against the so-called regime, and then people would rise up. And I'm one of the people who was in Iran in March who can tell you that the people rose up all right. They rose up and rallied behind the flag, basically. That's what happened, and it's still happening. Iranians came back in from Europe, they came back in from Turkey, they came from other countries to be at home, whatever differences they had with their government, and some of them did have differences. They wanted to defend their country from this foreign aggression, basically. So people have rallied behind the flag in Iran. The Iranian military has shown that the fight that it's been preparing for at least a couple of decades has it's borne fruit. Their strategy there of how they were able to conduct an asymmetric war, basically. And of course, the Israelis, and I think you've got commentators in the US like John Mearsheimer saying the same thing, and Douglas McGregor, that really Trump has lost. Any rational people in the Trump administration know that's the case, and they're looking for an off-ramp in some way. But the problem is that the Israelis, who are effectively part of the deep state, and who, of course, have the major funders of Trump's election campaign, they don't want an off-ramp. They want the US to keep attacking and to try and weaken. There's no end to it, basically. So that's the main pressure on Trump. The Israeli faction within his own deep state doesn't want an end to this war, but the political advisors and the more level-headed people there, to the extent that there are any, because of course a lot of them are sycophants who simply want to agree with the boss and get the nod of approval. But to the extent that there's any rational people there, they want an out, they want a way out. It's not easy to have it. And the thing that makes it more difficult is that the Zionists within the US deep state don't want an end to this at all. They want it to keep on going. And what you said about assassinating leaders and so on, that's what they tried from the beginning, from last year even. They assassinated many of much of the leadership in June last year, and they did it again in February, March this year, basically. So it's more of the same from the Israeli faction of the US deep state. That's the way I see it.
Assuming for the moment that they could get a deal. I mean, because let's be clear, the issue that the Trump administration is running into and why they don't do more strikes has to do with the global economy and specifically the US economy. He knows it will go off of a cliff. And he's been doing everything in his power to try to effectively manage the price of oil, energy in the United States. And despite doing everything in his power, it's still going through the roof, and it will go higher. Meaning, it's not about Trump being a moral man. It's not that. If he had a military solution, as you pointed out, he would take it. The issue is he doesn't have the solution, and he doesn't have the solution that doesn't necessarily throw the U.S. off a cliff. And so, assuming for the moment that they even get a deal, the interesting question that I have is about Lebanon. Iran has basically said, look, the war needs to stop on all fronts, meaning Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, specifically Lebanon. Israel seemed to have heard this and has gone on a murder spree in Lebanon. They were already on a killing spree, and they've amplified that much higher since word of deal, negotiation, all of these things have come to fruition. If indeed the U.S. gets a deal, how does Iran police Israel in that deal? And I hope that question makes sense, because obviously Israel has violated every deal that they've ever entered into, and they will most likely violate this one also.
And so has Washington, effectively. Washington has violated every deal they've done with Iran, basically. The Iranians know this. They've said it many times. Of course, the most notorious one is Trump with the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that the Obama administration cut. He tore that one up. But the Obama administration was also not respecting that deal. They were undermining it from the beginning, basically. So the whole Iranian experience with the U.S. administration is really, the flip side of the Israelis, basically, and whether they see it exactly that way, I'm not sure. But really, the unreliability of the U.S. is much the same as the Israelis, because everyone knows that the genocide in Gaza was not just underwritten, but there was active participation of the U.S. administration, the Biden administration and the Trump administration in that genocide. And of course, they gave the green light for the Israelis to invade Syria and to try to invade Lebanon for the fifth or sixth time, whatever it is, basically. So you're right, the Iranians have become more entrenched in the idea that if there's going to be any agreement, I think deal is a wrong term. It's sort of some sort of entrepreneurial concept that Trump has tried to promote himself as someone who knows how to make a deal. But what deal do you really make with someone who comes to murder you and destroy your children and so on? What sort of deal are they entitled to? We're talking about whether there's going to be some sort of peace agreement. A deal is probably the wrong word, I think, basically. But if there were to be some sort of peace agreement, Trump is looking for some sort of trophy, for some sort of consolation prize, at least, basically. The Iranians are going to get what they want in terms of their basic security concerns. The question is whether there is some sort of real or fabricated consolation prize that Trump could walk away with, I suppose. And he was looking for the enriched uranium, for example, which might have been a trophy he could have held up when they did that disastrous military operation in which they lost a lot of planes, which they claimed was about rescuing a pilot, but really it was a failed attempt to steal some of the enriched uranium around the city of Isfahan, or in the province of Isfahan. So that says to me that they were looking for some sort of trophy, and the uranium has become that sort of iconic sort of or symbolic sort of idea that somehow or other there is something to be seized there physically, which the Trump can hold up and say, look, we stopped these people from creating a nuclear weapon. And this is coming from the regime that has actually used nuclear weapons against civilians in a war itself, and the Israelis, which are a genocidal regime, which you cannot expect any sort of boundaries to the way that they conduct the war, So there's no real moral story here or moral equivalence in the story when you talk about nuclear things. And the Iranians, I think, finally have decided to simply ignore the whole nuclear issue, because things are very different for the Iranians now than they were a decade ago, or more than a decade ago, because back then, remember, Russia and China were supporting the US and the EU campaign to control Iran's nuclear program. Now you don't find that anymore. Basically, Russia and China are very strong allies in the background. They haven't taken a belligerent role in relation to the US and Israeli war against Iran, but they are certainly helping Iran in many respects, basically. So the constellation of powers has changed a lot in the last decade, and that's another thing that's in Iran's favor now.
Everything you said, agreed. I guess the one point, and before I move on to another topic, when Israel violates this deal by attacking Lebanon, which will be under the auspices of the deal, how does Iran respond? It's that part. Because I would imagine they would want to maintain whatever agreement or ceasefire that they make. As you point out, it's probably not an agreement. It's probably some kind of armistice of sorts. But in the same way they're trying to maintain the ceasefire here, they would probably want to maintain the ceasefire after some sort of deal. Israel obviously does not want to maintain any kind of deal, which again gets to the whole point of how do you even come to some kind of terms when one of the players that's considered a front in the terms has no interest in maintaining the terms. Meaning, regardless of what the U.S. wants, Israel has no interest in maintaining this deal and will most likely violate it.
But Israel's not a party to any agreement with the Iranians. The Iranians wouldn't have that. The Iranians don't even talk directly to the U.S. administration. They don't have any diplomatic. There's no U.S. embassy in Tehran.
True.
And there's a reason for that. The Iranians have taken that approach to their relationships with the US for 47 years or 48 years, whatever it is, since the revolution. So Iran,
but Iran Iran itself is saying that Israel is part of the front, and Iran itself is saying Israel must stop its attacks on Lebanon and Gaza as part of any deal.
That's right, but whatever agreement there may be, they want to have it with the US, basically. And so they expect the US to be able to control its rabid dog, basically. That's the way they look at it. Does the US have this control over the Israeli regime, basically? And to some extent, to some limited extent, Trump seemed to exert it some weeks back there when they started talking about this idea of a ceasefire in Lebanon, which, as you point out, didn't really happen. But that's the way the Iranians are looking at it. They're saying this is the Israelis are the rabid dog of the US, basically, and we expect you to control your rabid dog or not. And if you don't, then we will reserve the right to discipline them and punish them, because Iran, since the US attacked Iran, as I said, in many respects, the gloves are off, although there is still this Iranian morality, which is controlling the way that they do things. And they will inform, for example, the airlines in the Persian Gulf that we're firing missiles at this time. So your flights, there are still flights going through Abu Dhabi and some of the airports in the Persian Gulf now. I've got a friend who was in Cuba with me who flew through Abu Dhabi. I was surprised because I'd avoided going through the Persian Gulf. But the Iranians have this relationship even while the war is going on. And when they had the war last year, the same sort of thing. I was passing through the Persian Gulf on the way to Oman, and they were saying that missiles are being fired at these hours. Don't fly during these hours, then you can fly during those hours. So the Iranians have their own, in other words, they have their own rules and they have their own sense of how they're conducting this sort of war. But basically, in many respects now, if they find it, let's say, useful for the war purposes to discipline the Israelis, to punish them for breaching an agreement they see that they might have had with the US, they'll do it. Basically, to that extent, the gloves are off. They've been responding already. They're retaliating already. Same way with the Emirates. They retaliated against the Emirates because the Emirates were not just hosting US military machinery there, which was then used against Iran. The Emirates were directly involved in attacks against Iran. So the gloves are off to the extent that Iran will retaliate when it sees fit, basically. And so the point you made about the Israelis, I think they'll do the same sort of thing there, basically. I've seen reports to say that they have been doing that just recently, basically. So on the other hand, they've also been, of course, empowering the Lebanese resistance to the extent that the resistance has some new weapons and have been effectively forcing a withdrawal of Israeli invading forces in South Lebanon. What they can't control, and what's a factor in the air now, is that because Lebanon has zero air defense, because the government is so pathetic and weak and such a controlled by the US effectively, that they can bomb from the air. And they have been bombing the southern cities and also Beirut from the air. They've been threatening to bomb Beirut even further if their forces suffer more casualties in South Lebanon, basically. All of which is building up the logic for someone at some stage, and I mean Iran, basically, to help Lebanon secure some sort of air defense, because that's the main advantage that the Israelis have with Lebanon at the moment, because their invasion in the south is not really working. So, in other words, Lebanon itself, through the resistance led by Hezbollah in Lebanon, despite the pathetic moves of the so-called Lebanese government to collaborate with the US against the resistance in Lebanon, there's a force there, and there's a logic growing to say that Lebanon should indeed have some air defense to protect itself against these constant attacks.
Yeah. One last clip before moving on to Cuba, because that's the part, and well, I'm interested in all of this, but I'm very curious about your experiences on the ground. So this has to do with the Abraham Accords. And Donald Trump has come out and, well, he said a few things. One, he's claimed that Iran would have fired a nuclear missile by now had he not attacked. This is nonsense, and this is just bluster. Mm-hmm. But he's also, again, which is probably more bluster, but I want you to take on the Gulf states. And here we go.
Or is the only option you might want
I would for some of it, because it's a memorandum of understanding for speed. And one of the things that will happen is the strait will open immediately. But it's got to be perfect. I'm not going to do this. I didn't do this to get a crummy agreement. The worst agreement ever signed was by Barack Hussein Obama. What a horrible agreement that was. It was a setback for this country. The Middle East, a tremendous sign. And I think those countries owe it to us. Steve, are you going to get them to sign?
We're definitely pushing it, Mr. President.
I'm not sure we should make the deal if they don't sign. You want to know the truth? If they don't sign to join the Abraham Accords, I don't know that we have countries in there already. UAE, great countries, bold countries. And it's turned out to be so.
He is going so far as to say that the Gulf states owe him, they owe America to sign the Abraham Accords, and that maybe we should even have a deal if we don't sign the Abraham Accords. Is there going to be a reshaping of the Gulf after this war? Like, meaning these guys like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, etc., start to look around and recognize that their lot with the United States wasn't necessarily the greatest in the world.
Look, Trump is a delusional creature, as most people recognize these days. The Persian Gulf is already reshaped. It's already reshaped. There were some recent attacks on Kuwait, on the US bases in Kuwait, which is surprising, really, because the US side itself has already recognized, and it's been reported in some of the legacy media in the US, like the New York Times, that effectively there are no effective US bases in the Persian Gulf. They're all severely damaged or completely destroyed. The radar, the THAAD missile, the air defense and so on, it's gone. It's not functioning anymore. The naval base, the air bases, they're not functioning, basically. So the US has been driven out of the Persian Gulf already in the retaliation in that first month, effectively, from February, a month after February 28th, during Ramadan, basically. It's all gone. The question is whether those Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf are going to allow the US to come back and rebuild. And this has been mentioned in some of the congressional hearings where they were talking about, they were discussing how much damage had been done and what was the replacement cost for the aircraft lost and the bases lost. And one of the answers about the costs of the bases lost was that there was some unknown factors there, because they didn't know whether those Arab regimes were going to allow them to come back and rebuild effectively. And you see that now predictably, Oman is positioning itself as a much closer ally of Iran. Oman had traditionally positioned itself as a type of a neutral player, which was using its good offices for talks between different sides and so on. Now you see the Saudis have come out and said they're not going to sign the Abraham Accords because until there's a Palestinian state, the Saudis have got some sort of, even though they've collaborated under the table with the Israelis for a long time, they've got some sort of pride in terms of seeing themselves as having some standing in the Arab world, and that will completely disappear down the toilet if they do some open deal with the Israelis in the way that the Emiratis were doing it. The Emiratis have already lost very badly by being so deeply aligned with the Israelis. They've alienated even their Saudi senior partners in the GCC, basically. They went a step too far in Yemen, and the Saudis drove them out of the occupied part of Yemen, that occupied part of 20 or 25% of the populated areas of Yemen that are still not controlled by the revolutionary government in Sana'a, basically. So, and the Emiratis, by engaging with the Israelis in the Horn of Africa and in the terrible slaughter going on in Sudan, and attempts to create a succession movement in Somalia, basically, that irritated even the Saudis, that as well there, basically. So the Emiratis have been really destroying their reputation along the way there. It remains to be seen whether some of those regimes, like Qatar, for example, which has the potential for a very good partnership with the Iranians in the South Pass gas fields, which are massive gas fields on the Persian Gulf coast there, between Bushehr and Bandar Abbas in Iran, basically. But the Qatar and Iran share some of these underground gas reserves, basically. And the future of Qatar, if there's to be a future of Qatar, should really be in cooperation with the Iranians. So contrary to what Trump is saying, there's no real prospect that there's going to be some new re-energized Abraham Accords with all of the Persian Gulf Arab regimes starting to recognize and normalize with the Israelis in a way that the Emiratis and Bahrain did, basically. That's not going to expand. Rather, we expect it to go the other way around. Oman is leading the way there. It's likely that the Qataris will make a move in that direction, I think, although it's hard to see how the ruling regimes, of course, there's no democracy in any of these states. So they've all been very deeply embedded with the US for a long time. Qatar hosted the headquarters of the so-called CENTCOM, the Pentagon in the Middle East, basically. And so it's a hard one for the Qatar to break its relationship completely with the US military, but that's the direction in which they're being pushed. And if there's going to be an economic future for some of those states at all, they have to think very seriously about realigning themselves and having good relations with their big neighbor on the other side of the Persian Gulf, rather than some illusory relationship with the US, which obviously offers them no protection. It's very clear the only protection the US was offering was to the Israeli regime by trying to funnel or whatever air defense there was to the Israelis, and not doing anything to protect, not even the US soldiers who are in those bases in the Persian Gulf, basically. Some of the US soldiers have been complaining that they had no protection in Kuwait or Bahrain or wherever it was. But of course, all of those bases, the Iranians regarded as, bases of the enemy, basically, and they regarded the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and Kuwait, at least the regimes, not the people, as being part of the war machine that was being used against them. So that was the first point of retaliation. And of course, those Arab regimes know that if there's an escalation of the war, as the Israelis want, then Iran will and still has the capacity to inflict a lot more punishment on those states. And we haven't yet moved up the escalation ladder into their water supply, for example, their desalination plants, on which they are very dependent, unlike Iran, which doesn't depend on the very small amount of desalination it has there, or the civilian infrastructure or the oil infrastructure. So we haven't gone too far up that escalation ladder yet. But some of the better analysts in the US point out that Iran can only gain further if there's a push up the escalation ladder, because those so-called allies of the US there are going to suffer much more than Iran will. if there's a destruction of civilian infrastructure and water supply.
Let's move to Cuba. I am very interested in your take on what is going on. And let's start at the beginning. Donald Trump is basically implementing a blockade and strangling Cuba, or he's trying to. There have been reports of Chinese vessels getting through, dropping off supplies, but obviously this is not going to be enough for the entirety of a country. What did you see there on the ground? Give us the best that you can, kind of a picture of what life is like on the ground during the blockade.
Okay, so first of all, I would just spend a month in Cuba, basically, to update the situation there. And the things are extremely hard. They're as bad or worse than in the 90s, with some differences. You know, in the 90s, there was a huge economic depression in Cuba because their main economic partner, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, the trade relationship collapsed. And Cuba used to get all of its oil in a so-called sugar for oil deal from the Soviet bloc, basically, and export sugar in exchange. Later on, earlier this century, that to some extent was through, Cuba went through some big reforms in the 90s, opening up tourism, opening up joint venture investment in tourism and some other areas, developing its human services, particularly its health services. But then there was that relationship with Venezuela when Chavez was president in Venezuela, where they ended up doing a doctors for oil deal with Venezuela. So there was a moment where there was some, lifeblood was flowing into Cuban infrastructure and renovating transport and energy infrastructure for a period of time. And then, of course, the Obama regime and followed by the Trump regime started to blockade Venezuela more forcefully, up to the point now, basically, where the terrible type of coup that happened in Venezuela. And I should say this is important to understand Cuba now, that there was a betrayal in Venezuela. The Cubans didn't want to talk about it. The Venezuelans wouldn't talk about it. We don't know all the details of how it happened, around and following the kidnapping of President Nicolas Maduro, but there has been a betrayal of the principles of that state because, of course, the contracts or the agreements that the Venezuelans had with China, with Cuba, for example. China was providing credit to Venezuela and then receiving payment in terms of in the form of oil, basically. The Trump regime has managed to successfully block that. The same thing with Cuba. There was an agreement where the Cuban medical missions in Venezuela, which have been working there for over 2 decades now, a quarter of a century, basically, they are not being compensated. Trump has decreed that because Trump has effectively very substantial control over Venezuelan finances, that there be no oil or other compensation paid to China or to Cuba, basically. So the Cuban doctors working in Venezuela are being treated as individuals and given some sort of salary, but the Cuban health system is not being compensated in a way that it was contracted, basically. Then we've seen the US military carrying out operations. This is the military that kidnapped the president, that was involved in murdering close to 100 people during that operation, is carrying out military exercises in Caracas. They are surrendering to the US one of their former diplomats who was involved in getting around the economic blockade of Venezuela, Alex Saab, handed over to the US. Now, Cuba never handed over any political prisoners that they had. The Black Panthers that got political asylum in Cuba, none of them were ever handed over, despite the talks that the Cubans had with successive US administrations, So really, there's some serious departure from the principles of the Venezuelan revolution, the Bolivarian revolution there. And that has been part of the factor which has been used to strangle the Cuban economy. As you point out, the main part has been the fuel blockade in recent times. And so that's having a very severe impact on people. Transport is extremely difficult. The difference is there's some new assets in Cuba these days, but really the fuel blockade is the most savage thing that the Trump administration is doing to Cuba, and it's really hurting. People simply don't have access to transport. There was one Russian ship arrived, and that lasted a couple of weeks, the fuel from that Russian ship around the country. There was a second Russian ship which has been diverted apparently back into the Atlantic there. So on the other hand, there's been an increase in the renewables in the electricity grid, which does affect transport to some extent. That is to say, solar panels from the Chinese largely, but installed largely by Venezuelans, by Cubans, have been funneled into the national electricity grid. And there's a lot more electric vehicles in Cuba these days, a much higher level than in my country, for example. There is a substantial switch over into electric vehicles. The price of that's going up because of the lack of fuel, basically, and it doesn't solve the problem of transport at all. But there are some ambitious plans to advance renewables in the Cuban system, which they started to do in the 90s, but really didn't fully succeed with their ambitions back there, using biofuels and so on. So now with the solar panels, there's some serious attempt to increase the proportion of renewables, and in particular to build the infrastructure for recharging electric vehicles. But that does nothing for trucks and buses and so on, which are all set up to run on fuel, basically. So the Cuban people are really suffering from this. Of course, fuel always influences the food chain too, basically. So, there's a shortage of everything in Cuba except for rum and ice cream, basically, which is one of the strange contradictions you see if you visit Cuba. There's always rum, there's always ice cream, but not always wheat for bread, basically. There are a number of countries providing things to Cuba, aid to Cuba at the moment, not just China. Mexico has been a very strong ally for a very, very long time. There's a very historic relationship between Mexico, whatever the government. At the moment, there's a government that's very led by Claudia Sheinbaum. It's doing what it can. Mexico, the president says she is going to resume the shipping of fuel to Cuba. We have to see what happens there. So far, it's only the Russian ship that's got through. As I said, there are shortages of everything. Things are very, very difficult in Cuba, but there's still a very strong popular sense of resistance and defending the sovereignty of their country. And to sum up in a few words, I don't believe that Trump's best option was to try a type of Venezuelan maneuver on Cuba, as he succeeded in to a large extent with Venezuela. He failed with it in Iran. I think he would fail with it in Cuba too. I don't think he wants to do an invasion. I don't think that aerial bombardment of Cuba is going to look good for him. The one option he would like to do, he would like to increase the pressure to the point where he can create some sort of betrayal within the Cuban system and count on a failure of the resistance to follow through on that, as happened in Venezuela. I think there's a lot of dissatisfaction in Venezuela now, which is starting to bubble up to the surface. But I don't think the same thing is going to happen in Cuba, basically. But that's what Trump would be aiming at. I think he would like to see a type of a Venezuelan operation to decapitate and install some sort of compliant regime in Cuba. He hasn't got quite the same sort of incentives in terms of oil in Cuba, but apparently there's a Trump-linked company has got into the Sherritt company in Canada, is looking at a buyout of majority of shares, because Sherritt had this long historical relationship in a nickel mine in the east of Cuba, basically. And now the threat of US so-called sanctions has forced Sherritt to withdraw from that. But it seems like there might be some attempt, as you alluded to before, that really a lot of the talking up of these crises has created opportunities for oligarchic personalities in the US system to make money out of the way oil prices are going up and down with the statements coming out of Washington. And there may be a similar sort of maneuver there with the nickel mining operation in Cuba. But I don't think there's quite the prize there, the greed to satisfy Trump's greed. Cuba doesn't have quite the same sort of appeal that Venezuela did. Venezuela, after all, has the largest proven reserves of oil in the world, basically. So it's a very Venezuela was the state that fueled the U.S. military in both the First and the Second World Wars. So historically, the Venezuelan oil has had this appeal to U.S. administrations for a very long time. Cuba is a different sort of kettle of fish, really, and there's been this blockade for over 60 years now, and the Cubans have really grown up with it, basically. I'm not saying they can tolerate it, they are really suffering, but they've also got used to a certain extent to these sorts of pressures, and they've survived things. A lot of people didn't think Cuba was going to survive the 90s. They thought Cuba was going to go the way of all the Eastern European socialist states, and collapse with the Soviet Union. So we can't underestimate the capacity of the Cubans to resist these sorts of pressures, even though they are suffering extremely now. And also the Cuban intelligence, the capacity for Trump to find traitors to betray the Cuban Revolution, I think is far less than it was in Venezuela.
Explain to me like things like gasoline, like for example, if you're looking at, and I'm comparing it to America. So we have gas stations, and gas stations sell oil for a certain price. Food is sold at a certain price, grocery stores, etc. What do those things look like in Cuba? I mean, there are gas shortages, but that doesn't mean that there's no gas. How is it appropriated in the context of the state? Meaning, does it go to trucks for shipping? Is it just not available for people to purchase? How does that look on the ground?
Yeah, good question, because of course most of the fuel that was refined from the Russian ship has been used up. But what happened is some people have bought it and hoarded it and are reselling it at higher prices. So there's a type of black market going on, basically, because normally the normal sale of fuel when it arrives, and there is some Cuban oil being refined as we speak, basically. It's very heavy fuel. It needs diluents like naphtha, for example. It's even heavier than the Venezuelan fuel, I believe, and the Venezuelan fuel is very heavy and much heavier than Iranian fuel. It needs diluents to refine it, really, because the refineries will jam up if they're simply using this very heavy fuel. But the Cubans are now doing it with their own technology, and they've perforated 2 oil wells from the shore of Varadero on the north coast, under the Caribbean Sea, because Cuba, like Mexico and the US, has big reserves under the Caribbean. But for a long time they've known of this, but they didn't want to set up offshore platforms because the whole area in the Caribbean is subject to hurricanes, and they're vulnerable. And then their most precious beaches on the north coast, which are prizes for tourism, would be damaged, basically. So they've eventually got around to refining more of their own fuel on the north coast there, basically. So, but that doesn't solve their problems. As I said, there is still some vehicles moving, like what they call the Machinas, the old North American vehicles from the 50s, basically, which work as collective taxis. They'll pick up half a dozen people on some of the routes into and out of the capital. And somehow some of them use diesel because they've got different sorts of engines going on. They might be using Soviet engines or Mercedes or other sorts of things there. But they are getting this fuel, but they are getting it from resellers these days. They can't charge the local people too much because the salaries are tiny. The salaries are like, if you translate into US dollars, it's only a few dollars a month, basically. So they can't afford to pay a lot for transport. But people might pay, for example, $1 or $1.50 to get into the city if they live far out of the cities, basically. And the drivers, the private taxi drivers there, they are buying this fuel on the resale market, basically, and paying much more than the original official price from Coupe, which is the state oil company, which sells us in the first instance at normal, reasonable sort of prices. But people buy it, they hoard it, and then they resell it at 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times the original price. So people are paying huge prices now to get these big gas guzzling machines on the road. There are a lot of electric vehicles, which are, of course, dealing with a different source of things, but certainly there's hardly any buses running at all. You've got some trucks, for industry, but that's very difficult. But you do have some vehicles, but the roads are empty of sort of traffic that they had. even in previous times, or let's say before COVID and after Obama, when there was a big surge of tourism in Cuba, things were very, very different. There's hardly any fuel, tourists for the tourist industry now, and that means for restaurants, it means for musicians, so there's very little traffic on the roads there, but there is a market still, a type of a grey market or a black market for recycled fuel, which people are paying tremendous prices for. As I said, there's still some prospects that the Russians have been trying to send some fuel. The Mexican president has said she's going to send fuel through some mechanisms, through private companies, because, of course, the US is using, the US Treasury is using these excuses that they're trying to block the Cuban state for one reason or another, because they want to impose a different sort of foreign-controlled state there, basically. But because the fuel is going to a Cuban state company, CUPET, if it's going to a private company, it might be different. In the middle of all this, by the way, the US Embassy is petitioning the Cuban government to allow it to get diesel fuel, because the US Embassy needs diesel fuel for its generators, basically. So you've got all these little side deals going on where people are claiming some sort of privilege for, and indeed, a lot of the embassies are getting some quotas of fuels from different sources, basically. So in the same sort of way, the Mexican president has said that she's going to try and start sending fuel again, despite the threats that Trump has made of imposing massive tariffs on all Mexican exports to the US, which is quite a lot in terms of the Mexican economy. But Uruguay has sent food. There's a number of countries that Cuba has a lot of goodwill in the world. There's a lot of countries, a lot of states ready to send some aid. Some of the Europeans have been sending some small amounts of aid. So really, this is a terrible criminal act. And of course, if we go back into Cuban history, or let's say US history, the aim of the so-called sanctions, going back to the original ones imposed by John F. Kennedy, were precisely to starve the Cuban people, to make them desperate, to make them rise up against their government and overthrow their government. And the officials that said this back in the early 60s were pointing out that back at the time, Fidel Castro was very popular. There wasn't a viable political alternative, and the strategy would be, and was really what motivated the US so-called sanctions against Salvador Allende in Chile, against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, against Iran on various regimes, was precisely to starve the people, to make them desperate, to try and have a reservoir of people who would overthrow their own government and do the dirty work for the US government, instead of the US government having to do it itself.
I mean, and I guess this can be the last question. Should Russia and China run the blockade? I mean, this is outrageous. And as we pointed out when we first started this interview, it's the law of the jungle at this point. And I mean, it is outrageous what they're doing to Cuba. It is outrageous what they're doing to Iran. It's outrageous what they did to Venezuela. And at this point, this level of passivity is just considered weakness. The US is a rogue hegemon, and it seems to be doing whatever it wants. And, it's not like Russia and Cuba didn't have a relationship. I'm sorry, Russia and China didn't have a relationship with Cuba prior to this. They did. So I guess my thing is, I don't like seeing a country treated in this way. And obviously the Soviet Union had a relationship with Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis is kind of a historical footnote at this point. But should they run the blockade? Should they force the US to board those ships? Well, give me your take on this. I'm just curious in general.
You're talking about Russia and China?
Yes.
The thing is, if you look at their policies, they have their own interests, and their own interests are the things that preoccupy them. And they generally try to avoid a direct confrontation with the US, particularly in areas where it seems like it's a region that the US has some sort of priority in. The US administrations keep asserting this old idea of the doctrine of excluding outside the Monroe Doctrine, or the Donroe Doctrine, or whatever it is, to excluding other powers from the region, basically. it hasn't worked exactly that way, of course. China is now the biggest foreign investor in the whole of Latin America, has been for some time, basically. So China has a presence there, but of course they didn't step in to defend the Venezuelans. And you could say something similar with the Russians in Syria, really, that if Russia and China expect other countries to be able to defend themselves, even when facing a huge, as you say, hegemon's a polite way of talking about a criminal imperialist power, basically. Of course, Russia and China are very happy to see how well Iran has been able to do that. But Iran is a relatively large country with significant resources and with substantial development of its own asymmetrical defense capabilities and a lot of innovations indeed in military technology. Cuba's a little country, but with a very strong sense of sovereignty and resistance to this. What Cuba has always called the blockade, which they call a blockade, which the US administration have called an embargo, but it's always affected third parties, and particularly since the 90s when Congress approved a couple of laws to make the US blockade directly affect third parties, basically. It's been, the Cubans have called it genocidal because it's aimed at starving people, at making them desperate. And then that desperation translates into, at some stage, they were content that they were driving people into emigrating from the country. That's still happening, but that's a very long process. Every Cuban family has people who've emigrated, most of them to the US, basically. And most of the Cuban migrants to the US these days are relatively pro-Cuban, basically. There are groups now, Cuban Americans openly protesting against what the Trump regime is doing. They can't really, one weakness in the Trump strategy at the moment is it can't pretend to blame the Cuban government for what's going on with the economy now. Everyone knows because of the open aggression, because of the way people like Hegseth and what's his name, Marco Rubio and the others talk, because of the way they talk, it's very clear that this economic aggression is coming from Washington, basically. So they can't blame the Cuban government for these sorts of things. In the past, they would say, oh, it's the Cuban government. They're always using the blockade as a pretext. No, the Cuban people understand very well what's going on. Young people understand what's going on there very well. So the Cuban government has always called the blockade a genocidal action against the Cuban people. And now the Trump regime is trying to crank it up and thinking that it's tightening the noose bit by bit, basically. But Cuba has a lot of resources, still a lot of experience in resistance, and Cuba has friends in the world. And one of the slogans in Cuba is Cuba no está sola. Cuba's not alone. There are friends ready to help them. And Mexico is one of the best hopes now. If the Russian fuel ship doesn't get through, I think we can see some relief from some of its regional friends there, really. But things are extremely difficult. But it's by no means a sure thing that Trump's going to be able to destroy Cuba. I think that's another miscalculation. He miscalculated over Iran, and for somewhat different reasons. I think he's probably overconfident after what happened in Venezuela. He's overconfident that he can do something similar with Cuba. I don't think that's going to happen.
Tim, thank you for this. I always appreciate these conversations, and I'm fortunate to have you on the show, especially considering that you literally just came from Cuba, meaning you get to see it with your own eyes. It's not just reporting, it's seeing it. That's different. Tim Anderson, he is, I have to wear my glasses for this. Tim Anderson, he is a writer, internationalist, academic, and director of the Center for Counter-Hegemonic Studies. And you can find that at counterhegemonicstudies.site. Tim, where else can people find your work, by the way?
Well, probably on Twitter or X, basically. You'll find it under my name on Twitter. Yeah.
Very cool. Man, you have a good one. And I thank you for this.
Thanks.
You be safe, and you have a good rest of your night.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Shout out to Tim. He is a great guest. He's fantastic. I am going to be on the program at 9:00. Before we end this, though, I want to show something that was taking place yesterday. I want to show something that was taking place yesterday. And I guess I want to show this in two fronts. I showed the Hegseth video, which is just utterly absurd. But Donald Trump has also been putting out videos that have been unhinged in some of the things that he was saying. And I guess I'm not going to replay it since I showed it yesterday. But I do want to show one video. That's assuming that I still have this video. Right here. Right here. Right here. This is so deranged. This is so deranged. And it even goes against what the US intel was saying about Iran. Meaning there's nothing to corroborate this, nothing backs this up. This is all bluster. And I get the sense that what they're trying to do is to give an impression that either they won this or that it wasn't as profound of a loss as it actually is. Hence, they're spitting in the wind. Sure, I suppose they're talking to themselves, but the things that they're saying to themselves are outlandish. This is Trump yesterday. Listen to what he says here. And by the way, Trump will not get a better deal than Obama. Full stop. He will not get a better deal than the JCPOA. I just want to make that very clear before I even play this.
If we didn't hit them with the B-2 bombers, Iran would have had a nuclear weapon within 2 weeks from that date because they were ready to go. And if they had a nuclear weapon, it would have been used already. It also would have been used had I not terminated the Obama deal, the Iran nuclear deal, as we call it. That was in my first term. Had I not terminated that, they would have had a nuclear weapon a long time ago. I would say it was a guarantee that it would have been used. And it would have blown up Israel. It would have blown up the entire Middle East. And that's never going to happen.
Iran would have had a nuclear weapon, A, that's a guarantee. B, it would have been used. C, they would have attacked Israel. D, and E, of course, they would have also apparently blown up the entire Middle East. This is what the president is saying openly to justify a war that he lost. That's amazing. That's amazing. All of these things are lies. Obviously, everything that he is saying in that moment is a lie. And it is a lie being used to effectively justify the murder of men, women, and children. A murder by which he started the war, murdering a bunch of schoolgirls. He's lying through his teeth. Iran, against the advice of people like yourself, did not pursue or have a nuclear weapon. Full stop. Our own intel said they didn't have, nor were they pursuing a nuclear weapon. There's that. Trump is trying to justify to Americans who are now suffering, whether it's farmers, whether it's run-of-the-mill people, and obviously the poor suffers more so. But he's trying to justify why they're paying more for food, why they're paying more for gas, why, if strikes resume, their world is going to get that much more worse and that much more, let's say, oppressive in the sense of not having the things that they need or not being able to afford the things that they need. This is justification, A, for failure, but B, for pain. Justification for pain. Now, Americans will go out and see their fuel prices going up day by day by day, are looking at him saying, what the F are you doing? Why did you do that? And you can see it in the polling where Donald Trump is at Nixonian levels. And I mean, in a literal sense, Nixonian levels of disapproval. Trump is going to go down as the worst president we've ever had. Full stop. Not only is he a criminal monetizing the White House, but he is also while enriching himself, making everyone else that much poorer. He's making everyone that much poorer. The White House may be doing everything in their power to try to get across that they somehow won, or they somehow has beaten Iran, and their military is destroyed, and their voting is destroyed, and blah, blah, blah is destroyed. And yet they were launching attacks at Kuwait yesterday. That's interesting. You've destroyed their military capacity, and yet they're still firing off strikes, and they're still attacking your ships when your ships try to invade the strait. If indeed what Trump is saying is true, then Iran wouldn't be holding on to the Strait of Hormuz. If indeed what Trump is saying is true, he could impose a deal. We wouldn't be waiting on a negotiated settlement. And I've got to be honest, some of the reporting that came out was that the Trump administration was pissed off and angry, bitterly angry, that Trump wasn't able, as a criminal superpower that has gone out of control, to impose his will on the Iranians. That sounds more right than whatever this bloviating bluster that is coming out of the White House at this point. Speaking about the deal from the Iranian point of view, so Jeremy Scahill has, and DropSite has actually been doing pretty good work on this, have Iranian sources. Those Iranian sources, now just read it. Iranian official tells me from the Iranian perspective, the final straight of memorandum of understanding with the United States, that there is a final memorandum or final draft for a memorandum of understanding with the United States. But Iran has zero trust, I'm going to put that in quotes, in Trump or the United States' word, and can't rule out a chance for more U.S.-Israeli strikes. Therefore, Iran is proceeding cautiously on any official announcement. Quote, some voices on the Iranian side are concerned that President Donald Trump may reconsider his position at the last moment, the official said. Trump needs to cultivate the image of a victor in the war, which is what he's doing for his own audience. He added, quote, we cannot regard Trump's decision as definitively finalized until the financial markets close at the end of the week, unquote. They understand that Trump is a habitual liar. They get it. They understand that they're dealing with a sociopath. They get it. And fortunately, they are proceeding accordingly to that understanding. Do they believe they have a, quote, deal or memorandum that they can effectively negotiate further around? Maybe. I mean, look, the difficulty that I think a lot of people are having with this is that for all intents and purposes, the reality of it is that the U.S., that whatever Trump does, whether he walks and takes humiliation, even though he may loudly proclaim he's a victor as he's humiliatingly leaving, or whether Trump initiates more strikes, which may damage the global economy. It's that part that has given people a hint of a belief that the U.S. may be forced to accept this because they don't want to deal with the economic fallout of renewed strikes. That is the part, because under normal circumstances, if this was any other situation, I would assume that the U.S. would reduce strikes. But again, as I keep pointing out, for the first time in a very long time, for the first time in my memory, Iran has been able to implement and put a tax on America, where it is feeling in a similar way that America's put taxes on other countries where they feel ways because of the sanctions. And I said that very strangely. In the same way that we put sanctions on other countries, and it has physical, material reality impacts on the people who are in those countries. I'm saying Iran is doing that to us in a way that the Trump administration cannot pretend doesn't exist. It's kind of like, let's say UFOs. Pretend for the moment that the administration comes out and saying We have no real clear evidence that UFOs exist. And yet, the media is reporting people being abducted by UFOs. It's that. It's the administration trying to pretend that something doesn't exist when every time they go to their gas pump, it clearly exists. Every time they go to the grocery store, it clearly exists. When you go to McDonald's and buy fast food, it clearly exists. I'm trying to point out that it's almost like he's trying to pretend there are no UFOs, as UFOs are beaming people off the White House lawn. It's that. I'm saying the Trump administration is loudly proclaiming victory while simultaneously people in their normal way of life are dealing with the defeat. Iran, for the first time, has been able to tax America and tax everyday Americans for the war that the US started. That is a new phenomenon. That's different. The White House has to own that. The White House doesn't want to own that. Hence, people uncertain about whether the White House is going to tank the global economy for narcissistic and hubristic reasons. And we still don't know. Now, the reporting in the background is that they've come to a final draft of the agreement. Nobody knows if Trump is going to sign that agreement. Nobody knows if Iran is going to sign that agreement. And to be honest, I don't trust the reporting on this until I actually see the agreement. We'll see. Some of the reporting is that the White House needed more time to kind of get their mind right. Who knows? Until it's signed, what he said, nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon. That is an axiom, and that axiom is completely true. As they said, Trump can renew sneak attacks after agreeing to the deal. He's an untrustworthy entity. There's that. So that is where we are in the context of the war in regards to Iran and the United States. And I am not even of certainty that Israel is one plain spoiler. For all I know, the Trump administration is trying to blame the Israelis for any kind of renewed aggression and renewed strikes, where they could try to say, well, hey, don't blame us. Blame Israel for this. Israel is our dog. Full stop. Full stop. You can't blame them. Blame us. They are our dog. There are two videos I want to show before I close this, and I want to give commentary on these two videos. One, has Russia kicked it up a notch? Meaning, ever since the attack on those kids that have taken place, Russia has put out a very clear warning to Kiev that it seems where they are pointing out Kiev is now fair game. And if there are diplomats or people from Europe or people from the United States that just so happen to be in Kiev, you have been put on notice. Leave now. We are going to attack Kiev, and it is going to be systematic, effectively. Meaning, this idea that Kiev is no longer in play or that we only hit them on random occasions, off the table. Off the table. They've reiterated this. Again, which on some level gets across the seriousness of what they are effectively trying to get across.
Всем. Ну, вы знаете, здесь скорее так слабо применимо такое выражение, как каким-то действием.
I'm going to read this out
Все наши...
because, you know, none of us speak Russian, but let's start it from the beginning. He says, well, you know, here, rather, it is less applicable. Okay, dude, let me speed up. I think all our actions are visible. Moreover, we warn about some actions in advance. In this case, you talked about warning the ambassadors to leave Kiev. It was done very seriously and consciously because it can happen at any moment. And at that time, when we consider that the answer should be as powerful as that we have talked about many times. Now, I would say this. We responded to the terrorists that caused the victims among our children, young people, photographs of whom we saw and showed them to everyone. The question that I have is very straightforward. When Russia responded to the attack on the college, where Putin turns to the military and says, hey, we need a military solution to this. And within a day, maybe even less than a day, they responded with 600-700 missile strikes, missiles, drones, etc., land, sea, air, basically a coordinated strike across multiple fronts, hit Kiev, and then you had two Orezhniks that also effectively hit airfields. They did not drop Orezhniks on Kiev proper, they dropped it on the airfields. Now, that does not seem like that was an overnight thing, meaning the idea that this was something that they just did, I think is nonsense. This was obviously planned. This was obviously prepared. So the question becomes, is the college being used as an excuse for what was already going to be a change in policy in the first place? Also, why are they telling diplomats to leave? Now, obviously, the Europeans don't seem to believe the Russians in this. And America has said that they haven't left Kiev either. And herein lies the problem. And herein, I would argue, is the issue with, let's say, the Russian position up to this point. As I pointed out, if I don't think you're serious, then there may be reasons for me not thinking you're serious. And in this case, Europe has crossed one Russian red line after the next till it got to the point where they no longer believe Russian red lines. It behooves Russia to get their seriousness clear. Just a heads up. I mean, obviously, I'm coming from the States. And in coming from the States, I know these people are sociopaths. And because they're sociopaths, they're going to push and push and push. And when they got to the point of disbelieving Russian threats, I would argue that is more dangerous, far more dangerous, than making it clear that you are serious and your red lines are actually red lines. Again, I say that because what you end up with is the potential for what we have now, which is Russia says, hey, we're serious about this. And they say, we don't believe that you're serious about this, which pushes Russia into a particular behavior that they may otherwise not have gotten to if indeed, let's say those red lines were established, clear, and everybody in the West believed it because Russia has made it clear that they're serious. I'm saying those are very different things. If I tell you I'm going to do something you don't believe me, you may push me to act. And the consequences of it will be disastrous. As opposed to me saying, I'm going to do this if you do this. And you full well believe me because I've shown in the past that I am completely serious in whatever provocative action that I've taken to get across my seriousness. The dynamic between Russia and the West needs to fundamentally change. And my fear is that it will take something extraordinarily provocative to get that across. Is Putin willing to do that? Is this a change in policy? Now, I've asked John Helmer about this, and John Helmer said he believes that this is an actual change in policy. Does it mean the special military operation is fundamentally changing character? I don't know. Does it mean that Russia is going to be more provocative in their actions? I suppose, I don't know. We'll see. But I will say, stop with the threats and just act. Stop with the threats. I don't know if anybody cares about threats. And I say that whether it's true for Iran, and I say that for Russia. I don't know if anyone cares about threats. From their point of view, your threats don't matter. From their point of view, they consider all of this to be issues of weakness. Threats matter less. The other video I want to show It's a UFO video. And I'm pretty sure that at this point, the views are going to go down to zero. But there is an interesting conversation taking place in the UFO community that people may not necessarily be paying attention to, but it's there kind of in eye shot. I will be honest with you. I do not believe, how can I say this? In general, I am very dubious about Jeremy Corbell, just to be transparent. I've seen him boost videos that were fakes. And maybe they weren't fakes, but the interpretation was wrong. Like, meaning they were military videos, and he was claiming that they were somehow UFOs. All right. That being said, Corbin is on News Nation, and Corbin, UFO reporter, I put him reporter in quotes. And yes, I'm being very shady right now when I'm saying this stuff. He comes on and says,
not just all the different intelligence agencies you can name, they were scrambling to figure out, to be the smartest person in the room, to find out if our president does make an announcement, whatever he says, they need to be ahead of, as they say, ahead of the 8 ball, right?
Right. So what are they asking specifically?
They want to know how to transmit this information to the American public, the fundamentals. We are not alone, or whatever it might be. How do you describe? You have to define the terminology. You also have to say why you've kept this hidden for so many years, who you've hurt to keep it hidden. Why would you hold this back, the nature of reality from humankind? Why would you do it? So the comms people were trying to figure out how to look like heroes.
You say that the communications department of the White House reached out to you. What did they want?
Yes. Well, actually, I've been reached out to comms departments from not just the Pentagon, not just the White House, not just all the different intelligence agencies you can name. They were scrambling to figure out to.
all right. All right. So, according to Corbell, the comms department of all sorts of intelligence services were trying to figure out how to communicate something about the UFO phenomena to the public. And in trying to do so, they reached out to him. They reached out to him. Now, there are people who are actually, like, on social media who were covering this story and said, why wouldn't they reach out to him? Why wouldn't they reach out to him and George Knapp in order to try to communicate this in a way that makes sense? These guys are reporters of sorts. They covered this stuff. Why would Corbell not be the person they reach out to? Now, to be fair, it's the Trump administration. It's a clown car. These people are incompetent. So I don't doubt that they would reach out to Corbell to do this. Now, and I guess this sounds very shady, even though it's not meant to be shady. The argument that was being made was, why wouldn't you reach out to somebody who is in media and who does, let's say, UFO content for a living? Corbell being one of those people, meaning why wouldn't this be the person you reach out to? That argument to me sounds ridiculous. You think of all the people who are instrumental from the standpoint of media, and you think of all the people who are in the UFO circuit who does media for the UFO circuit and those type of things. Do you reach out to a UFO person, or do you reach out to somebody who is more capable? And I hate to say this, has more credibility. George Knapp, fine. George Knapp, fine. George Knapp has been a paragon in this area for a very, very long time. Corbell, it just seems very weird to me that the CIA would reach out to Corbell for anything, let alone how to communicate this. They have had all sorts of studies, information, research, etc. They have access to billions of dollars where they can effectively figure out how do we lie to the American public and craft a narrative around the UFO issue. And maybe that's the issue. They're looking for people who are in, let's say, the UFO circuit in order to communicate this particular information to the wider public. I don't know. For some reason, I am very dubious about this, even though that's a hell of a lie for Corbell to put out. It sounds like I'm saying two things. I'm saying the Trump White House is incompetent. And if indeed the Trump White House is trying to throw chum into the water in order to distract, this may be a good way to do it. Obviously, the UFO thing is a shiny object that Donald Trump is effectively throwing out in order to distract from what is taking place from Iran, what is taking place in regards to the fallback effects and the consequences on the American public. This is a shiny object. I don't think this shiny object works. I'll say that. And B, I have a hard time believing that the president is going to come out, show a daily alien, kick a UFO on the tires and say, I'm Trump, I'm out. This is disclosure. I don't foresee that. So from my point of view, this is all distract. With comms, communicate with Corbell on this issue. A Trump White House? Maybe. I don't know. It's an interesting sad story. I'll put it that way. It's an interesting sad story. And by the way, next week I have Red Panda Koala. He's a UFO guy on social media. He's going to be on the show to discuss some of the releases that have come out from the Trump administration. This should be super interesting, to put it mildly. He is going to be on. In fact, I need to nail down the date. It's going to be sometimes next week. Karen Kowatowski, she's going to be on. John Helmer, Carl Shaw, both of them are going to be on together. I tried to give them a break this week. I have a bad taste in my mouth from bringing people on like week to week. And that was from Ritter, just to be honest. Because I tried to get him on back to back. And I think between the negative comments that were on that video that he was last on, between the questions that he was asked, because I don't think he likes being questioned, and between me trying to get him on back to back, especially bringing him back on with the hopes of someone in an interview, if I'm being blunt, criticizing his take when he was on Deason's show. All of those things left a bad taste in my mouth in regards to bringing people on week to week. So I think it puts too much pressure on the guests. That being said, I'm going to close this out because I'm going to be on Ted Rawls. I'm going to be on the program with Ted Rawl. It's called the program Ted Rawl and Jamal Thomas. So I'm not giving ownership to Ted, even though from my point of view, Ted was there first. Ted was there first. But I'm going to end this. Sloboda every Monday. Please enjoy the black pill first thing in the morning. I know, right? I know. Yeah, so Sloboda every Monday. I have been fortunate. Like getting ill and being away for 3 months. And my guests still agreeing to come back on. The audience staying with me mostly. After being away for 3 months. I mean, obviously, there was going to take time to spin back up the show, so there's that. But even this idea of the network collapsing and like the audience that was there prior remaining with me, yeah, I've been fortunate. Not to mention the guests that have been willing to come on the show, even when the show wasn't at 75,000 subs. Not to mention all of you. So I'm going to end this. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share. I'm going to say subscribe. It says, I only watch the program for John Kiriakou. Well, hopefully you'll watch it because I'm on the show also. And you enjoy the back and forth between Ted and I. Look, I have to be honest with you. I enjoy shows where I have co-hosts, especially a co-host that you get along with. Those are fun. I think the back and forth adds a level of engagement that is not necessarily there when you're doing the show individually on your own. And that's true when I'm with Garland, that's true when I'm with Nick, that's true when I'm with Ted. And part of the reason why I do these shows is because it's a good outlet. I just like it. The back and forth is fun. Yeah, I enjoyed the program. All right. I am going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. I'm going to be moving over to the program. We're going to start at 9 a.m. So definitely check us out. You all be safe. You all be kind. And I will see you. If anything happens over the weekend, you'll see me over the weekend. You may see me later tonight or over the weekend playing chess. We'll see. But we are going to be, oh, by the way, 10 o'clock, Dimitri Lascaris is going to be here. And 10:30, Michael Maloof is going to be on. So after the program, I will be back here for another remainder of the show. That has been the model that I've been going with. So basically, we have the morning show that takes place first thing in the morning. There will be 1 or 2 interviews, ideally 2 interviews. Every so often, 1 interview if the interview goes a bit long. And after that, oftentimes over the course of the day, there will be additional shows, kind of like today. So at 10, Dimitri Lascaris, 10:30, Michael Maloof. Stay tuned. Be back shortly. You guys be safe. You'll be kind. Oh, you can support PayPal, Patreon, Super Chat, memberships. All of those things help support the show. Even super stickers, which I still don't know what super stickers are because they have super chats, which seems to do the same thing. That being said, all of these things are beneficial to the show and helps the show keep ticking along. You have my thanks for it. I'm going to end this. I'm going to say like, share, and of course, subscribe. Have a good one all. Be safe.